17 nannies, 6 months, none lasted more than 48 hours. Some quit after 2. Others didn't even make it through the first night. The Pemberton twins weren't just difficult children, they were something the childcare agencies had never seen before. Something that made grown women flee in tears. Something that had professionals filing police reports and therapists refusing to return. "I've been doing this for 30 years, the agency director said, closing the file. "I won't send another woman into that house." But Grace Steve wasn't just another woman. And what she walked into that Tuesday evening would test everything she thought she knew about broken children, about trauma, about herself. Because in 48 hours, something would happen that no one saw coming. Something that would change the rules. Something unbelievable. The call came at 11:47 p.m. "They've locked me in the bathroom," the voice whispered into the phone. "I can hear them outside the door, waiting." This was nanny number 14, certified behavioral specialist, a decade of experience with troubled children. She was crying. "Ma'am, are you in danger?" the 911 operator asked. Long pause. Then, "They're 4 years old. How do I explain that I'm terrified of 4-year-olds? She quit before sunrise, left her suitcase behind, never came back for it." Miles and Mason Pemberton, identical twins, 4 years old, living in a Silicon Valley mansion worth $12 million with a father who couldn't look at them. The file didn't explain much. Mother died in childbirth. Father, Alexander Pemberton, tech billionaire, works 18-hour days. The children have been through 17 nannies in 6 months. Escalating behavioral problems. Refused to speak to therapists. Destruction of property. Possible danger to caregivers. But the file didn't explain what happened to nanny number 5's laptop, or why nanny number 9's clothes were found shredded in her suitcase, or what nanny number 12 saw when she woke up at 3 a.m. that made her pack and leave within the hour without saying a word to anyone. The agency stopped asking questions. They just stopped sending people. "There's one more application," Margaret Chen said reluctantly, holding a file she'd already rejected twice. "But I don't care what you think." Alexander Pemberton's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp with exhaustion. "Send her. Send anyone." Grace Steve stared at her laptop screen at 2 a.m. in her small Brooklyn apartment. The job posting had been up for 6 days. Exceptional compensation, immediate start, live-in position, difficult children. The cursor hovered over apply. Her phone buzzed. A voice message from her mother in Lagos. "You cannot run forever, Nankim." Grace's eyes drifted to the photograph on her desk. A young boy, 9 years old, smiling, her brother, dead 15 years now, drowned while she was supposed to be watching him. She clicked submit before she could change her mind. 3 days later, she stood in the marble entryway of a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum. Alexander Pemberton looked like a man barely holding himself together. Expensive suit, hollow eyes, the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of not sleeping. "My sons are difficult," he said. "Not a warning, a surrender." "I've worked with difficult children before," Grace replied. "No." He shook his head. "You haven't. Not like this." Somewhere in the house, something crashed, glass breaking. Neither of them flinched. "The agency probably told you about the 17 nannies," Alexander continued. 18, Grace corrected. "I'll be 18. Most don't make it past the first night. The record is 48 hours. After that," he trailed off, looking away. "After that, something always happens. They always leave." "What happens?" Grace asked. Alexander's jaw tightened. "That depends on how long you last." A small sound made them both turn. 2 identical faces peered around the corner. 4 years old, curly hair, wide eyes that should have looked innocent but didn't. They weren't smiling. They were studying her. The way a scientist studies something under a microscope, the way a chess player studies the board before making a move. Grace felt something cold slide down her spine. Some instinct, some recognition of danger that had nothing to do with the children's size or age. "Hello," she said anyway, kneeling down to their level. The twins didn't respond, didn't blink, just kept watching. Then, in perfect unison, they turned and walked away. Their footsteps synchronized, disappearing deeper into the mansion. Alexander let out a breath. "That's the most interest they've shown in anyone in months." "Is that good?" Grace asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "With them, I never know anymore." The clock on the wall read 6:47 p.m. Grace had been in the house for exactly 12 minutes, 47 hours and 48 minutes, until she hit the 48-hour mark. If she made it that long, if whatever happened to the others didn't happen to her first, she didn't know yet what the twins were planning. Didn't know about the bucket of ice water balanced above her bedroom door, the salt mixed into her toothpaste, the carefully placed obstacles in the dark hallway she'd have to navigate at 3 a.m. She didn't know that the twins had held a whispered conference that afternoon, planning exactly how to make her leave, that they'd done this 17 times before, that they'd gotten very, very good at it, and she especially didn't know that in 47 hours she would do something so unexpected, so dangerous, so completely against every rule of professional childcare, that it would break something open in those boys that had been locked away since the day they were born. Something that would make Alexander Pemberton finally face what he'd been running from for 2 years. Something that would force Grace to confront the failure that had haunted her for 15 years. The clock kept ticking. And somewhere in the mansion, the twins were watching, waiting, planning. But what happened when Grace opened her bedroom door that first night? What did the twins do that had worked on 17 others before her? And what secret was hiding in that mansion that nobody was talking about? Before we continue, hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a like if you're already hooked and tell us in the comments, what do you think the twins are really afraid of? Let's continue. Grace Steve's hands trembled as she stared at the job posting on her cracked laptop screen. 2 a.m. in her tiny Brooklyn studio, the radiator hissing like it was trying to warn her. Live-in nanny position. Silicon Valley. Exceptional compensation. Immediate start required. What the posting didn't say screamed louder than what it did. No mention of the children's ages. No photo of the family. Just one line at the bottom that made her stomach twist. Previous applicants need not reapply. Her phone buzzed. A voice message from her mother in Lagos, the timestamp showing it was morning there. Grace played it on speaker, her mother's Yoruba accent wrapping around the English words like a warm blanket. Nkem, I had the dream again, the one about David. He was standing at the water's edge, and he was smiling. He said to tell you it's time to stop running. Grace's throat tightened. 15 years since her 9-year-old brother drowned while she was supposed to be watching him. 15 years of carrying that weight. 15 years of convincing herself she had no business helping children when she'd failed to save her own brother. But her visa was expiring in 3 months. The cleaning jobs barely covered rent. Her mother needed surgery back home. Grace wasn't running anymore because she wanted to. She was running because she was out of options. Her cursor hovered over the apply button. Every instinct told her this job was wrong, that no position offering 3 times the normal salary was ever what it seemed. But desperation has a way of making terrible ideas look like answered prayers. She clicked submit before fear could stop her. The response came in 47 minutes. An automated email with a video call link and a time, 10 a.m. Eastern today. No pleasantries. No questions about her qualifications. Just a demand disguised as an invitation. Grace showed up to that video call with her best interview clothes and her worst poker face. The man on the screen looked like he'd aged a decade in the past year. Alexander Pemberton, the email signature had said, tech billionaire, founder of 3 startups, Forbes 30 under 40. None of that showed in his face now. Just exhaustion carved so deep it looked permanent. I'll be direct, Miss Steve, he said, his voice flat. My sons are difficult. Grace had heard that before. Every parent of a challenging child called them difficult, like it was a diagnosis instead of a cry for help. The agency mentioned you've been through 17 nannies in 6 months, Grace replied, keeping her voice steady. Alexander's jaw tightened. 18, counting you. The question isn't whether you're qualified, it's whether you'll actually last. Something in his tone made Grace's skin prickle. This wasn't the usual parent warning about tantrums or picky eating. This was something else. What happened to the others? She asked. The silence stretched so long Grace thought the connection had frozen. Then Alexander leaned forward, and for the first time, she saw something besides exhaustion in his eyes. Fear. They left, he said simply. They all left. 2 days later, Grace stood in the marble entryway of a mansion that cost more than she'd earned in 10 lifetimes. The silence was wrong. Houses with young children had a sound, a life to them. This place felt like a museum after closing time. Beautiful and cold and waiting. Alexander appeared from a side hallway, looking worse in person than he had on video. His suit was expensive enough to fund a small country, but it hung on him like he'd forgotten his own size. "They're in the playroom," he said, not offering to show her. "Down the hall, third door on the left. I have a call in 5 minutes." He was already walking away before Grace could respond. Running, she realized. The man was running from his own children. The playroom door was open. Grace knocked anyway, a courtesy the twins probably hadn't experienced in months. No response. She stepped inside and felt every hair on her arm stand up. Two identical boys sat cross-legged on the floor, 4 years old with curly brown hair and faces that belonged on a parenting magazine cover. But their eyes, God, their eyes, they weren't looking at her the way children look at new adults, with curiosity or shyness. They were studying her, cataloging her, like scientists examining a specimen they were about to dissect. Grace forced herself to kneel to their level, to meet those unsettling gazes. "Hello," she said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "I'm Grace. You must be Miles and Mason." Silence, the kind that felt deliberate, weaponized. Grace had worked with traumatized children before, back when she still believed she could save them. She recognized this silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they refused to say. "I know you don't want me here," Grace continued, deciding honesty was her only play. "That's okay. You don't have to want me here." The twins exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. Then the one on the left spoke, his voice completely flat. "You're going to leave. They all leave." Not a question, not even really a statement. A fact they'd learned the way other kids learn their ABCs. "Maybe," Grace said, and watched surprise flicker across both their faces. Maybe no adult had ever agreed with them before. But not today. The one on the right tilted his head. "We'll see," he said. Then both boys stood in perfect synchronization and walked out of the room, their footsteps matching like they shared the same heartbeat. Grace stayed kneeling on the floor, her pulse hammering in her ears. She just made a promise she had no idea if she could keep. To two children who'd been taught by 17 broken promises that adults were liars. The clock on the wall read 6:47 p.m. Grace had been in the house for exactly 12 minutes. 47 hours and 48 minutes until she hit the 48-hour mark that no one else had survived. If she made it that long, if whatever broke, the others didn't break her first. Somewhere in the massive house, she heard a door close. Then whispered voices. Then nothing. The twins were planning. And Grace was exactly where 17 women before her had been. Alone in a beautiful house that felt like a trap. With two 4-year-olds who'd learned that the best way to protect yourself from abandonment was to make people leave before they could choose to go. Chapter 2, The 48-Hour Gauntlet. Grace woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of nothing. That should have been her first warning. She'd been trained to recognize the dangerous silences, the moments before everything breaks. But jet lag and exhaustion had dulled her instincts. She swung her legs out of bed, bare feet hitting cold hardwood, and reached for her bedroom door. The handle turned easily, too easily. She pulled the door open and had exactly half a second to register the massive bucket balanced on the doorframe before 20 gallons of ice water crashed down on her head. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath, soaking through her nightshirt and into her bones. Grace stood there, dripping, gasping, while water pooled around her feet and her heart hammered against her ribs. Down the hallway, she heard it, breathing. 2 sets of lungs, perfectly synchronized, waiting in the darkness for her to scream, waiting for her to storm out of the room, to call for Alexander, to pack her bags like nannies 6, 9, and 14 had done, waiting for her to prove what they already knew, that she was just like all the others. Grace wiped water from her eyes and laughed. Not a fake laugh, not a forced sound to show she was unbothered. A real laugh, the kind that bubbles up when something is so absurd you can't quite believe it's happening. "Creative?" she called out to the darkness. "Your mother must have been brilliant." The breathing stopped. Grace wrung out her hair, grabbed a towel from the bathroom, and called out again, softer this time. "Good night, boys." Then she closed the door and changed into dry clothes, her hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. She'd just passed the first test, but she could feel in her bones there would be more. Morning came too early. Grace found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee, though when she poured herself a cup and took a sip, her mouth flooded with salt. The twins had replaced the sugar. The milk was vinegar. Even the bread had been switched with something that looked right but smelled wrong. Grace set the cup down calmly, turned to find Miles and Mason watching from the doorway, and asked the question that would change everything. "Would you like me to make you breakfast, or would you prefer to make it yourselves?" Silence. Then Mason, or maybe it was Miles, she still couldn't tell them apart, spoke. "We want pancakes." Grace nodded. "Then let's make them together." The suspicion on their faces was almost comical. This wasn't in their script. The others had either tried to punish them or pretended nothing was wrong. No one had ever suggested collaboration. But curiosity, that universal child instinct, won out over their defensive training. They climbed onto kitchen stools while Grace pulled out flour, eggs, real milk from the back of the fridge where they hadn't tampered with it. The pancakes were a disaster. Flour everywhere, eggshells in the batter. One pancake burned black because Miles got distracted telling Grace about a bird he saw yesterday, the first unprompted thing either twin had said. But they ate every bite. And for 5 minutes, sitting at that enormous marble island in a kitchen bigger than Grace's entire apartment, they almost looked like normal children. Almost looked like they'd forgotten they were supposed to be making her leave. When Alexander appeared in the doorway, briefcase in hand, already heading to his office, he stopped, stared at his sons, flour in their hair, syrup on their faces, actually smiling. Grace watched something crack in his expression before he turned away. "I have meetings all day," he said to no one in particular. Then he was gone. The afternoon brought the next test. Grace discovered she'd been locked out of the house. The back door clicked shut behind her while she was checking the garden, and every entrance was suddenly sealed. She was trapped outside in the California heat with no phone, no water, no way back in. The old Grace, the one who'd failed her brother, would have panicked, would have pounded on the doors, begged to be let back in, proved to the twins that she needed them more than they needed her. This Grace sat down on the porch steps, pulled out her phone, she'd learned to keep it in her pocket after this morning, and started playing music. Nigerian high life, the kind her mother used to dance to in their kitchen. Grace sang along in Yoruba, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn, completely unbothered by being locked out of a $12 million mansion. 20 minutes passed. Then a small face appeared in the window. Mason, she thought, though she still wasn't sure. His expression was confused, frustrated. This wasn't working the way it was supposed to. After another 5 minutes, he opened the window. "What language is that?" he called out. Grace smiled. "Yoruba. My mother sings these songs to me." A pause. "Did you like your mother?" The question hit Grace in the chest. The past tense they used for everything, these children who'd never known their own mother. "Very much," Grace said. "She's still alive. I call her every Sunday." Mason's face did something complicated. "Ours isn't," he said, so quietly Grace almost missed it. "I know, honey," Grace replied. "I'm so sorry." The lock clicked. The door opened. Grace went inside. That evening, while exploring the massive house, Grace found their room. She wasn't snooping, just trying to learn the layout before nightfall. But when she opened the closet, looking for extra blankets, she found something else entirely. A shrine. Photos of a woman with kind eyes and the same curly hair as the twins. A silk scarf that still smelled faintly of perfume. Crayon drawings in childish hands. "Mommy, we miss you. Come back." Grace's throat closed. She should have left. Should have respected their privacy. But something made her kneel in front of that closet, made her speak to the photograph of Catherine Pemberton, like the woman could actually hear. "They're beautiful, your boys," Grace whispered, "and they're so hurt. I don't know if I'm strong enough to help them. I don't know if I'm the right person. But I promise you this, I'll do my very best by them." She didn't know the twins were standing in the doorway. Didn't know they'd been watching her for the past 30 seconds, their faces cycling through confusion, anger, something that looked almost like hope. When Miles finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She talks to Mommy," he said to his brother. Mason nodded slowly. "Nobody talks to Mommy." They disappeared before Grace could turn around. But something had shifted, some microscopic crack in the wall they'd built around themselves. Hour 47 came at 5:47 p.m. the next day. Grace was in the bathroom when she noticed it. The floor was wet, not soaking, just enough to be slippery. The bath mat had been moved, the hand towel repositioned. This wasn't a prank. This was a trap, And unlike the water bucket or the locked door, this one was dangerous. Grace could see exactly how it would happen. She'd step out of the shower, her feet would slide on the wet tile, she'd fall and crack her head on the marble counter. The twins would hear the crash, they'd come running, and they'd see what their test had actually done. Grace had a choice. She could avoid it, carefully dry the floor, pretend she didn't notice, or she could spring the trap and show them something no one else had. She thought about her brother, about the water that took him, about how she'd learned too late that sometimes love means getting hurt. Grace stepped deliberately onto the wet floor. Her feet went out from under her. She hit the tile hard, her hip taking the worst of it, pain exploding up her side. She cried out before she could stop herself. Then they were there, Miles and Mason, their faces transformed by pure terror. "Are you okay?" "We didn't mean Grace. Are you okay?" They were pulling at her arms, trying to help her up, their voices high and panicked in a way that shattered their usual cold composure. Grace sat up slowly, wincing, and did something that would change everything. She smiled. "I'm okay," she said, even though her hip was screaming and she was pretty sure she'd have a bruise the size of a dinner plate. "I'm okay, and I'm still here." Mason's eyes filled with tears. Real tears. The first genuine emotion Grace had seen from either of them. "But we hurt you," he whispered. Grace reached out and touched his face gently. "People who love you sometimes get hurt. That doesn't mean they leave." The twins stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language, because to them, she had. In their world, hurt meant abandonment. Mistakes meant consequences. Love was conditional and fragile, and always, always temporary. Grace had just rewritten their entire understanding of how relationships worked, and she'd done it by refusing to break. The clock on the wall ticked over to 6:47 p.m., 48 hours. Grace Steve had officially lasted longer than any nanny before her. She was still there, still staying, still choosing these broken, terrified children over her own safety. In his office, 3 floors down, Alexander Pemberton sat staring at the security camera footage. He'd watched everything: the water bucket, the locked door, the bathroom floor. He'd watched Grace laugh, sing, speak to his dead wife's photograph, deliberately hurt herself to prove a point, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to cry. Because someone was finally fighting for his children, and he didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified of what that might cost her. Chapter 3. Breaking Through. By day 3, the household staff had started whispering. Grace Steve wasn't just surviving, she was doing something none of them had seen before. She was reaching the unreachable. That morning, she found the twins in the playroom, sitting apart from each other for the first time, each in their own corner, like boxers retreating to separate sides of the ring. The air felt heavy with something Grace recognized: guilt. Children who hurt someone and then watched that person stay didn't know what to do with the cognitive dissonance. Their entire worldview said Grace should have left, but she was still there, limping slightly from yesterday's fall. But there. "I brought something," Grace said, settling onto the floor between them. She pulled out her phone and opened a folder of old files she'd kept from her psychology days. "When I was little, my grandmother used to tell me stories about Anansi the spider. He's a trickster from West African folklore. Very clever, always getting into trouble." Miles looked up, interest flickering in his eyes despite himself. "What kind of trouble?" Grace smiled. "Well, once Anansi wanted to own all the stories in the world, so he made a deal with the sky god. The god said if Anansi could capture 4 impossible things, a python, a leopard, a hornet, and a fairy, all the stories would belong to him." Mason moved closer, just an inch, but Grace noticed. "Did he do it?" Grace launched into the tale, using different voices for each character, letting the twins interrupt with questions, watching as their defensive walls crumbled piece by piece. Anansi was a trickster, yes, but he was also clever and brave and flawed, just like them. By the end of the story, both boys were sitting cross-legged in front of her, their faces animated in a way she'd never seen. "Can we act it out?" Miles asked, then immediately looked scared he'd shown too much enthusiasm. "Can we be Anansi?" Grace handed Miles a black marker. "Draw spider legs on your arms. Mason, you be the sky god." For the next hour, the playroom transformed. The twins weren't destroying anymore, they were creating. Building a web from yarn, using pillows as jungle animals. Laughing, actually laughing. The sound carried down the hallway to Alexander's office, where he stood frozen in his doorway, briefcase in hand, listening to his children sound like children for the first time in 2 years. That night, Grace learned what the twins had been running from. At 3:07 a.m., a scream shattered the silence. Not a prank, not a test, a scream of pure terror. Grace ran down the hallway, her injured hip protesting, and burst into the twins' room. Mason was sitting up in bed, sobbing so hard he was choking on his own breath. Miles was already beside him, looking small and helpless and scared. Hey, I'm here," Grace said, climbing onto the bed and pulling Mason into her arms. His small body was shaking, his pajamas soaked with sweat. "Mommy was drowning," he gasped between sobs. "I couldn't save her. I tried, but I couldn't." Grace's heart shattered. "Sweetheart, you were a baby. You couldn't have saved her." "But Daddy says," Mason choked on the words. Grace went very still. "What does Daddy say?" Miles answered, his voice hollow. "He doesn't say it, but we know. He can't even look at us. We killed Mommy by being born." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace felt rage flood through her, hot and fierce, at Alexander for letting his children carry this unbearable weight. But she pushed it down. Later. Right now, these boys needed truth. "No," Grace said firmly, cupping Mason's face so he had to look at her. "No, baby. Your mother's body was sick. It wasn't strong enough for what childbirth demanded. That's not your fault. That's not anyone's fault. Medicine failed her. Her body failed her. But you two, you didn't fail anyone." She pulled Miles close too, holding both twins against her chest. "Your mother chose to have you. She wanted you. Every single day she carried you. She chose you." Then Grace did something she'd learned from her own mother. She started singing. A Yoruba lullaby, soft and rhythmic, about a mother's love that transcends death. The twins didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. Mason's sobs gradually quieted. Miles's rigid body relaxed. And outside in the hallway, Alexander Pemberton stood with his back against the wall, listening to a stranger sing his sons to sleep while speaking truths he'd been too cowardly to say himself. The next evening, Alexander appeared at Grace's door. She'd been recording notes on her phone, old therapeutic habits returning, and looked up, surprised. He rarely sought her out. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was rough, like he'd been shouting or crying. Probably both. They went to his office, a space that felt more like a fortress than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Silicon Valley. Awards and patents on the walls. Photos of Catherine everywhere except where his sons could see them. Alexander didn't sit. He stood by the window, his back to Grace, shoulders rigid with tension. "I heard what Mason said last night. About them killing her." Grace waited. Let the silence stretch. She'd learned that broken people needed space to break further before they could heal. "I never said those words," Alexander continued, his voice cracking. "I never told them it was their fault. But I..." His hands curled into fists. "I couldn't hide what I felt. That if they hadn't been born, Catherine would still be alive. I tried. God, I tried to separate them from it in my mind. But every time I looked at them, all I saw was what I'd lost." Grace's voice was controlled, but anger simmered beneath. She chose to have them. She wanted them. "I know. Do you?" Grace stood. "Because your sons don't know. They think they're murderers. They think you can't love them because they killed the person you loved most. They're 4 years old, Mr. Pemberton. 4. And they're carrying guilt that's crushing them." Alexander finally turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face raw with emotion he'd been suppressing for 2 years. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be what they need." "Then start by being present," Grace said. "Not perfect. Present. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to show up. Can you do that?" The question hung between them. Alexander looked at this woman, this stranger who'd walked into his disaster of a household and somehow made his children laugh again, and nodded. "I don't know how." "Then I'll teach you," Grace said simply. "But you have to actually try. Not for me. Not for some idea of what a good father should be. For them. Because they're running out of time to believe anyone will stay." Day 6 brought a setback. Grace should have seen it coming. The twins had been softening too quickly, letting their guard down, and that terrified them more than any prank or test. When you've learned that attachment equals abandonment, intimacy becomes the enemy. Grace was in her room when she heard the crash. She found them in the hallway, surrounded by the contents of her small suitcase. Everything she owned, thrown on the floor. And in Mason's hands, torn into pieces, was the photograph of her brother David. Grace felt like she'd been punched. That photo was one of the only things she had left of him, the last picture taken before he died. She stood there, staring at the pieces of her brother's smile scattered across expensive hardwood, and felt 15 years of grief crash over her. She didn't cry, couldn't cry, just knelt down slowly and started picking up the pieces with shaking hands. The twins watched, their faces cycling through triumph, then confusion, then horror, as they realized what they'd actually done. "Who was he?" Miles asked quietly. Grace's voice came out rough. "My little brother, David. He drowned when I was 15. I was supposed to be watching him." The twins went very still. They understood drowning, understood being left behind by death. "Did you kill him?" Mason asked, the same question they'd been asking themselves for 2 years. "No," Grace said, still gathering pieces. "But I thought I did. For a very long time, I was sure it was my fault. That I should have saved him. That I should have seen it coming. That if I'd just been better, smarter, faster, he'd still be alive." She looked up at them, tears finally spilling over. "How did you stop thinking that?" Miles whispered. "I'm still learning," Grace admitted. "But I know this. Carrying guilt for something you couldn't control doesn't bring them back. It just makes you too heavy to live your own life. And the people we lost, they wouldn't want that for us." Mason's face crumpled. "We're sorry about your picture." The apology was small and broken and real. Grace pulled them both into a hug, and for the first time, the twins didn't fight it. They melted into her, crying for her loss and their own, understanding in a way only traumatized children can, that grief makes you family. When Alexander found them like that 30 minutes later, Grace and his sons tangled together on the hallway floor, surrounded by scattered clothes and torn photographs, he finally understood what he'd been doing to his children. He'd been so busy grieving his wife that he'd forgotten his sons were grieving their mother, and they'd been doing it alone. Day 7 brought unexpected healing. Grace woke early and found the twins already awake, waiting outside her door like they'd been standing guard. "We want to show you something," Miles said. They led her downstairs and out the back door to a space Grace had noticed but not explored. Catherine's garden, or what used to be a garden. Now it was an overgrown tangle of weeds and dead flowers, abandoned since she died. "Mommy loved it here," Mason said softly. "She was going to teach us about flowers when we got bigger." Grace looked at the neglected space and saw possibility. "Would you like to bring it back? Make it beautiful again for her?" The twins looked at her with such hope it hurt. "Can we?" For the next 3 hours, the three of them worked in the California sunshine, pulling weeds, clearing dead growth, planting new flowers that would bloom in spring. The twins were careful with the plants, reverent almost, like they were handling pieces of their mother. "If we make it pretty," Mason asked, dirt under his fingernails, "will Mommy see?" Grace smiled. "I think your mother sees everything you do, and I think she's very proud of you." Miles paused in his digging. "Even when we're bad?" "Especially then," Grace said. "Because being hurt and scared and still trying, that's the bravest thing anyone can do." They worked until their hands were filthy and their faces were flushed, and something like peace settled over the garden. Alexander watched from his office window, seeing his sons smile in the space their mother had loved, and felt something crack open in his chest. That afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He cleared his schedule, told his assistant to cancel everything, and he went downstairs to the garden where Grace and his sons were planting roses. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice uncertain. The twins looked at him like he was a stranger, because in many ways, he was. But Grace handed him a trowel and smiled. "We're planting a memory garden. For their mom." Alexander knelt in the dirt beside his children. His hands shook. He didn't know what to say. But Mason reached over and put one small, dirty hand over his father's. "It's okay, Daddy," he said. "We're all still learning." And in that moment, in a garden his dead wife had loved, Alexander Pemberton finally started learning how to be a father to the sons he'd abandoned in his grief. Chapter 4. The final test. Day 8 began with an eerie quiet. Grace woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the unsettling absence of sound. No whispers in the hallway, no small footsteps, no pranks waiting behind her door. Just silence. She should have recognized it for what it was, the calm before something breaks. But 3 days of breakthrough had made her optimistic, made her believe the worst was behind them. She was wrong. The twins were in their room, facing each other on Miles's bed, having the kind of wordless conversation only identical siblings can have. They'd felt it happening. The softening, the attachment, the dangerous, terrifying feeling of starting to love someone who could leave. What if she goes away? Miles whispered, voicing the fear that had kept them both awake. What if we love her and then she leaves like everyone else? Mason's face was pale. We should make her leave first, before it hurts more. They'd been here before, 17 times before. They knew the script by heart. Push hard enough, hurt enough, break enough trust, and the person leaves. It was a law of nature as reliable as gravity. But this time felt different. This time, they didn't want to do it. What if she's different? Miles asked. What if she actually stays? Mason shook his head. Nobody stays. We have to know for sure. We have to test her one more time. The plan they devised was their masterpiece. No water buckets, no locked doors, no slippery floors. This would be the ultimate test. If Grace survived this and stayed, maybe, just maybe, she was real. They spent the morning while Grace was helping Alexander in his office, setting up their trap at the top of the grand staircase. Fishing lines stretched across the top step, nearly invisible. The Oriental runner carefully repositioned to slide. The banister subtly loosened from its moorings. It was genius. It was deadly. And they told themselves it was necessary. They had to know. They had to protect themselves before their hearts broke completely. By afternoon, everything was ready. The twins positioned themselves in their room, door cracked, waiting. They'd sent Grace upstairs with a fabricated story about a spider in their bathroom. All she had to do was come back down. All she had to do was take those stairs. Then they'd see. Then they'd know if she'd leave like the others. Grace finished checking the bathroom, no spider, of course, and headed back toward the stairs. The house staff had tried to warn her. Maria, the housekeeper, had grabbed her arm in the hallway. Miss Grace, be careful. The boys, they're too quiet today. Something's wrong. But Grace had just smiled. They're healing, Maria. Sometimes healing looks like quiet. Now, standing at the top of the grand staircase, Grace saw it. The fishing line. The repositioned runner. The way the banister looked slightly off. Her psychology training kicked in instantly. This wasn't a prank. This was a test. The final test. The twins needed to know if love was conditional. If it broke when things got dangerous. If she would abandon them when they pushed too far. Grace had a choice. She could call out to them, dismantle the trap, explain why this was dangerous. She could alert Alexander, have them punished, teach them that actions have consequences. Or she could do something insane, something that went against every rule of professional childcare. Something that might finally convince two terrified children that love doesn't run away. She thought about her brother, about being 15 years old and watching him drown while she stood frozen on the shore, about spending 15 years running from situations where she might fail again, about how she'd learned too late that sometimes love means diving into dangerous water. Grace took a breath and stepped deliberately onto the fishing line. Everything happened fast and slow at the same time. Her foot caught, the runner slid, her hand grabbed for the loose banister, and it gave way. Then she was falling, tumbling down the grand staircase, her body hitting marble edges, her head cracking against ornate railings. She tried to catch herself, but momentum had taken over. The world spun, pain exploded everywhere. 14 steps. She counted every one. When she hit the landing, she didn't move, couldn't move. Everything hurt. Her wrist was screaming. Her ribs felt like fire. Blood was running down from somewhere on her head. But worse than the physical pain was the sound. The sound of two small boys screaming, "Grace! Grace! No, no, no!" Footsteps thundering down the hallway. Then they were there, Miles and Mason, their faces transformed by absolute terror. "We're sorry!" Mason was sobbing, his hands hovering over her like he wanted to help but didn't know how. "We're so sorry. Please don't die. Please don't leave us." Miles was pulling at her arm, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't mean it. We just wanted to see if you'd stay. Everyone leaves. Mommy left. Daddy left. Everyone goes away." Grace forced her eyes open, forced herself to focus through the pain and the dizziness. She saw their faces, Saw two 4-year-old children absolutely shattered by what they'd done. Saw the exact moment they realized they'd hurt someone who'd never hurt them back. "I'm right here," Grace whispered, her voice rough. She tried to lift her arm and gasped at the pain. "I'm not going anywhere." "But we hurt you," Mason wailed. "We always hurt people and they leave." Grace pulled him close with her good arm, ignoring the way her ribs screamed in protest. "And I'm still here. That's what love means, babies. I'm still here." The twins collapsed against her, sobbing like they'd been holding back for 2 years, which they had. All that grief, all that fear, all that desperate, terrified love with nowhere to go, it poured out of them in broken sobs and gasping breaths. That's how Alexander found them. He'd been in a video conference when he heard the crash, the screaming. He'd run from his office in time to see Grace at the bottom of the stairs, bleeding, his sons breaking down in her arms. Every instinct screamed at him. Call an ambulance, document this, protect himself legally, fire her before she could sue. This was liability. This was a lawsuit waiting to happen. This was every wealthy person's nightmare. But then he really looked, saw his children crying real tears for the first time since Catherine died, saw them clinging to Grace like she was the only solid thing in their collapsing world, saw this woman, injured and bleeding, comforting them instead of pushing them away. Alexander dropped to his knees beside them. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I'm here now." He pulled all 3 of them into his arms, careful of Grace's injuries. "I'm not leaving either. Not anymore, I promise. I'm done running." For the first time in 2 years, the 4 of them held each other. A broken father, 2 traumatized children, and a woman who'd learned that sometimes love means falling downstairs. They stayed like that until the housekeeper called 911, until the sirens approached, until paramedics gently separated them to treat Grace's injuries. But something fundamental had shifted. The twins had pushed as hard as they could, done their worst, created their most dangerous test. And Grace hadn't left. She'd chosen to stay, chosen to fall, chosen them over her own safety. That kind of love rewrites everything you thought you knew about the world. The emergency room was chaos. Grace had a sprained wrist, bruised ribs, a minor concussion, and various cuts that needed cleaning. Nothing broken, nothing permanent. She'd gotten incredibly lucky. The twins refused to leave her side. The nurses tried to move them to the waiting room, but Mason clung to Grace's good hand while Miles pressed himself against the hospital bed. "Please," Miles begged the nurse, "please let us stay. We need to stay." The nurse looked to Alexander, who was holding both boys with one arm while keeping his other hand on Grace's shoulder like he needed the contact to remember this was real. "They're family," he said firmly. "They stay." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Family? I thought she was the nanny." Alexander's eyes met Grace's. Something passed between them. Understanding. Commitment. The beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. "She's family," he repeated, and Grace felt tears slip down her face. The doctor examined her, asked questions. How did this happen? Grace could have told the truth. Could have explained about 2 traumatized children and a test that went too far. But she looked at Miles and Mason, saw the fear in their faces, the terror that she'd finally tell on them, and prove she was like all the others. "I fell," Grace said calmly. "The lighting was poor. I missed a step. It was an accident." The doctor looked skeptical. "You fell down 14 stairs." "I'm clumsy," Grace said. The doctor glanced at Alexander, clearly not believing her. Alexander held his breath. This was the moment. Grace could destroy them right now. Could have his children investigated, his parenting questioned, his entire life examined. His lawyer was probably already drafting settlement offers. But Grace just smiled and repeated, "It was an accident." The twins started breathing again. Mason squeezed her hand so tight it hurt. Miles pressed his face against her arm and whispered, "Thank you." When the doctor finally left, shaking his head, Alexander looked at Grace with something like awe. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why protect them?" Grace touched Miles's hair, wiped tears from Mason's face. "Because they're not bad children. They're hurt children. And hurt children don't need punishment. They need proof that love doesn't leave." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve you. They don't deserve—" "Stop," Grace interrupted gently. "Deserve has nothing to do with love. Love isn't earned. It's given." She looked at the twins, these 2 small boys who'd put her in a hospital bed and were now looking at her like she'd hung the moon. I'm not leaving. I promised. Remember? I said I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. And I'm nowhere near ready to say goodbye. Mason climbed carefully onto the hospital bed, mindful of her injuries. Miles followed. They curled up on either side of her like small animals seeking warmth. Forever? Miles whispered. Forever, family? Grace looked at Alexander over their heads, saw a man who just watched a stranger love his children better than he'd been able to, saw someone who was finally ready to stop running, saw the beginning of something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Forever, family, Grace confirmed, and meant it. The twins fell asleep like that, holding on to her like she might disappear. Alexander sat in the chair beside the bed, watching them, one hand resting on Mason's back. For the first time in 2 years, his children were at peace, because someone had finally convinced them that love doesn't always end in loss. That sometimes, even when you push as hard as you can, even when you do your worst, even when you hurt the people who care about you, sometimes they stay anyway. That's the kind of love that changes everything. That's the kind of love that heals. And watching Grace with his sons, Alexander Pemberton finally understood what he'd been missing. Not another nanny, not another employee, but family. The real kind, the kind you choose, the kind that stays. Chapter 5, Forever Family. The first week after the hospital was strange. Grace moved through the Pemberton mansion with her wrist in a brace and her ribs wrapped tight. But she wasn't moving through it alone anymore. Miles and Mason had become her shadow. They brought her water before she asked, fluffed pillows behind her back, drew pictures of her with giant smiles and hearts everywhere. They transformed from children trying to drive her away into children terrified she might leave. Every time Grace went to another room, they followed. When she napped, they sat outside her door like small guards. At night, they asked if they could sleep on the floor of her room, just to make sure she was still there in the morning. You don't have to watch me every second, Grace said gently on day 3, finding them both staring at her while she tried to read. I'm not going anywhere. Mason's voice was small. But what if you change your mind? Grace set down her book. These children had learned that love was temporary, that safety was an illusion, that the people who promised to stay were the first to leave. Words wouldn't fix that. Only time would. Only showing up, day after day, even when it was hard. Come here, she said. They climbed onto the couch on either side of her, careful of her ribs. Grace wrapped her good arm around both of them. I know you're scared. I know every person before me left, but I need you to understand something. When I fell down those stairs, I had a choice. I could have been angry. I could have left. I could have told everyone what you did. The twins tensed. But I didn't, because I love you. And love doesn't run away when things get hard. Love stays, even when it hurts, even when it's scary, even when it would be easier to leave. Miles looked up at her, his eyes full of wonder and fear. How long will you love us? It was the question Grace had been waiting for, the one every traumatized child eventually asks. How long until you leave? How long until I'm too much? How long until love runs out? I can't promise I'll never die, Grace said honestly, because these children had learned too young that death was real. But I can promise that as long as I'm alive, I'm choosing you. Every single day. That's what family means. But you're not our family, Mason said. You're our nanny. Grace smiled. Is that all I am? The twins looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them. Then Miles said what they were both thinking. You feel like more. You feel like... Mason hesitated, afraid to say it out loud. Like a mom? Grace's throat tightened. She thought about Catherine, about the woman whose garden they'd restored, whose memory lived in every corner of this house. I'm not replacing your mother. She'll always be your mom. But if you want... I can be your Grace, and Grace can be family too. Alexander appeared in the doorway, briefcase forgotten in his hand. He'd been coming home early every day since the hospital. Actually coming home instead of hiding in his office. Learning to be present even when it was uncomfortable. Especially when it was uncomfortable. Can I join? He asked, his voice uncertain. The twins looked at him like they still weren't sure he was real. This version of their father, who came home for dinner, who asked about their day, who didn't disappear into work the moment things got emotional. But Mason scooted over and patted the couch cushion. Alexander sat, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Miles did something brave, He leaned against his father's shoulder, just a small gesture, but it was the first time he'd initiated physical contact in 2 years. Alexander's hand came up to rest on his son's head, and Grace saw his hand shaking. "I'm sorry," Alexander said quietly. "I'm so sorry I left you alone for so long. I'm sorry I let you think your mother's death was your fault. I'm sorry I was too broken to see that you were breaking too." Mason started crying, silent tears running down his face. "We thought you hated us." "No," Alexander said, his own voice thick. "No, I never hated you. I hated myself, for not being able to save her, for not being enough, for failing the one person I'd promised to protect." He pulled both boys close, this broken father and his broken sons. "But I'm done running. I'm done hiding. Grace showed me something." He looked at her over their heads. "She showed me that love means staying even when it's terrifying. Even when you don't know what you're doing. Even when you're scared you'll fail." Grace felt tears slip down her own face. "We're all scared," she said softly, "but we're scared together now. That makes it easier." Week 2 brought a new rhythm. Alexander cleared his mornings to have breakfast with the twins. Grace taught him how to make their favorite pancakes, the ones they'd made together that first morning. He was terrible at it, burned 3 batches before getting one right. But the twins thought it was hilarious, and their laughter filled the kitchen in a way it never had before. Afternoons were for the garden, Catherine's garden. They all worked there together, planting flowers that would bloom in spring. Mason liked the roses. Miles preferred the lavender. Alexander carefully tended the section that had been Catherine's favorite, and sometimes Grace would find him there alone, talking to his dead wife like she could hear him. Maybe she could. Evenings were for stories. Grace introduced them to more Anansi tales, but also stories from around the world. Alexander added science fiction, his favorite genre. The twins would curl up between them on the massive sectional sofa, and for an hour each night, they were just a normal family. Not a billionaire and his traumatized sons and the nanny who'd fallen down the stairs. Just people who'd chosen each other, who were learning what family meant. One night, after the twins had fallen asleep during a story, Alexander looked at Grace and said what he'd been thinking for days. "I don't know how to thank you." Grace smiled. "You don't have to." "I do," he insisted. "You saved my children. You saved me. You walked into this disaster and somehow," he shook his head, "you made us a family again." Grace looked at the sleeping twins, their faces peaceful in a way they never were when she first arrived. "They saved me too," she said quietly. "I spent 15 years running from my guilt, convincing myself I had no business helping children because I'd failed my brother. But these boys," her voice caught, "they taught me that failure isn't permanent, that you can be broken and still be worthy of love, that sometimes the children you save are saving you right back." Alexander reached across the couch and took her hand. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, but full of something neither of them was ready to name yet. "What happens now?" he asked. Grace squeezed his hand. "Now we keep showing up, keep choosing each other, keep building this family one day at a time." "Is that enough?" "It's everything," Grace said. Week 3 brought the conversation Grace had been dreading. Alexander asked her to his office, his face serious. Grace's heart sank. This was it. The moment he'd tell her that things had gotten too complicated, that he needed a professional nanny, that what she'd done, loving his children, falling downstairs, becoming family was too much. She sat across from his desk, her wrists still braced, and waited for the blow. Alexander pulled out a folder. Official-looking documents with legal letterhead. "I've been talking to my lawyer," he said, and Grace's stomach dropped. He was going to sue her, or fire her, or both. "And I have something to ask you." He slid the papers across the desk. Grace looked down, and her vision blurred with tears. Guardianship papers. Legal documents naming her as co-guardian of Miles and Mason Pemberton. "I know this is fast," Alexander said, rushing the words like he was afraid she'd say no. "I know we've only known each other 3 weeks. I know this is insane by any conventional standard. But Grace," he leaned forward, "you're not their nanny. You haven't been from the moment you walked into this house. You're their family, and I want to make it legal. I want you to be their guardian. Not as an employee. As their," he searched for the word. "As their Grace," Grace supplied, using the twins' word. "As their Grace," he agreed. Grace stared at the papers through her tears. This was everything she'd been afraid to want. A family. children who needed her, a place to belong. But fear crept in anyway. Alexander, I'm not, she struggled to find the words. I'm not perfect. I failed before. What if I fail them? You won't, he said with certainty. And even if you do, even if you make mistakes, you'll still be here. That's what matters, not perfection. Presence. He stood and came around the desk, kneeling beside her chair. Grace, you taught me that love isn't about being perfect, it's about staying. You stayed when 17 others ran. You stayed when my children were at their worst. You stayed when they literally put you in the hospital. If that's not proof that you're exactly who they need, his voice broke. Who we need, then I don't know what is. Grace looked at this man who'd been so broken when she met him, who'd been unable to look at his own children without seeing loss, who'd hidden in his work and his grief and his guilt. Now he was kneeling beside her, asking her to legally bind herself to his family, offering her everything she'd been too afraid to reach for. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. Yes, of course, yes. Alexander's face transformed. Relief and joy and something deeper. Something that looked like the beginning of love. He pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of her still healing ribs. The twins don't know yet. I wanted to ask you first, but they've been asking me every day if you're going to stay forever. I think this is the only way they'll really believe it. That evening, they told the boys together. Grace and Alexander sat them down in the garden, surrounded by the flowers they'd all planted together. We have something to tell you, Alexander started. The twins immediately looked terrified. Bad news always started with, we have something to tell you. Mason grabbed Miles's hand. Grace saw it and rushed to reassure them. It's good news, the best news. She pulled out the documents. Your father and I have been talking, and we want to make something official. Miles looked suspicious. What? I'm going to be your legal guardian, Grace said. That means I'm choosing to be your family, not just as your nanny, as someone who will always be in your life, someone who gets to help make decisions about your future, someone who's not going anywhere. The twins stared at her. Processing. Then Mason said in a tiny voice, Forever family? Forever family, Grace confirmed. Miles's eyes filled with tears. But what if you change your mind? What if we're bad again? Grace pulled them both into her lap. You could be bad every single day for the rest of your lives and I'd still be here. That's what forever means. That's what family means. No more tests. No more wondering if I'll leave. I'm legally promising to stay. Mason buried his face in her shoulder and sobbed. Miles clung to her neck, and Grace held them while they cried out 2 years of fear and abandonment, and the desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone meant it when they said forever. Does this mean you're our mom now? Miles asked when he could speak again. Grace looked at Alexander, then back at the twins. I'm your Grace. Your mom will always be your mom. But Grace can be family too, if you want me to be. We want, Mason said fiercely. We want you forever. Then you've got me, Grace promised, and meant it with everything she had. Alexander watched them, this woman and his sons, and felt something slot into place. This was his family, broken and rebuilt and unconventional and absolutely right. He cleared his throat. There's one more thing. The twins looked up. Grace is going to officially be your co-guardian. That means she gets to sign permission slips and come to parent-teacher conferences and make decisions about your lives. But it also means, he looked at Grace, it means she's not leaving. Ever. She can't just quit and walk away. She's legally committed to you. Miles processed this. So we really can't make her leave? You really can't, Alexander confirmed. Mason smiled through his tears. Good, because we love her. I love her too, Alexander said quietly, and Grace's heart stuttered. It was too soon to say it like that, to acknowledge what was growing between them. But it was there, in every shared glance, every careful touch, every moment they'd built this family together. The twins, oblivious to the adult tension, launched into excited chatter about what having Grace as their official guardian meant. Could she come to school? Would she live with them always? Could they tell everyone she was their family? Grace answered every question, her heart so full she thought it might burst. That night, after the twins were asleep, Alexander found Grace in Catherine's garden. She was watering the roses by moonlight, her braced wrist making the task awkward. You don't have to do that now, he said. Grace smiled. I wanted to. This place feels sacred somehow. Alexander came to stand beside her. Catherine would have liked you. She would have loved what you've done for them. For us. I wish I could have known her, Grace said honestly. I wish I could thank her for giving me these boys to love. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by growing things, by life emerging from what had been dead. Then Alexander said, I meant what I said earlier, about loving you. Grace's breath caught. Alexander, I know it's too soon, he said quickly. I know we need time. I know we both need to heal more. But I wanted you to know. You walked into my life and somehow made me remember what it means to live. You gave me my sons back. You gave me hope. And somewhere along the way, he turned to face her. You gave me a reason to believe in family again. Grace set down the watering can. I'm not asking you to marry me, Alexander continued. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But I'm asking you to stay. Not as an employee. Not just as their guardian, but as part of us. As someone who's building this family alongside me. I'm already staying, Grace said softly. I signed the papers, remember? I'm legally committed now. That's not what I mean, Alexander stepped closer. I'm asking if you can see a future here. With them. With, he hesitated, with me. Grace thought about her small Brooklyn apartment. About the life she'd been living, small and scared and running. About how she'd come here desperate and broken and convinced she had nothing left to offer. And she thought about Miles and Mason sleeping upstairs, finally feeling safe, about this man who'd learned to be a father again, about a garden that had come back to life, about a family that had chosen each other. Yes, she said, I can see a future here. Alexander smiled, real and genuine, and Grace realized she'd never seen him actually smile before. It transformed his face, made him look younger, made him look like someone who'd finally stopped running from his grief. Then let's build it, he said. One day at a time. One day at a time, Grace agreed. And there in Catherine's garden, surrounded by roses and moonlight and the promise of tomorrow, they started building something new. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something that honored the past while reaching for the future. A family. Imperfect and unconventional, and absolutely real. 3 months later, the Pemberton house had transformed. It was still expensive, still enormous, still more mansion than home. But now it had sounds. Laughter echoing down marble hallways. The twins arguing about whose turn it was to set the table. Grace singing in the kitchen while she cooked. Alexander actually leaving his office to join them for dinner. The household staff had stopped whispering. They'd watched Grace go from nanny number 18 to legal guardian to something more. They'd watched Alexander become a father instead of a ghost. They'd watched 2 traumatized children become just children. One afternoon, Maria the housekeeper found Grace in the laundry room, folding tiny clothes while humming. You did good, Miss Grace, Maria said. Those boys, they're different now. Happy. Grace smiled. They did the hard part. They chose to heal. I just stuck around while they did. More than that, Maria said. You loved them when they were unlovable. That's what changed everything. After Maria left, Grace thought about that. About loving the unlovable. About how everyone said the twins were monsters, were beyond help, were too broken to fix. About how they weren't any of those things. They were just children who'd been drowning, and no one had jumped in to save them. Until she did. And in saving them, she'd saved herself. That evening, the twins burst into the kitchen with something clutched in Miles's hands. Grace! Grace! We made something! They'd been in art class at their new preschool. Alexander had finally enrolled them after years of refusing to send them anywhere. The teacher said they were thriving, a little behind socially, but catching up fast. Miles held up a drawing, 4 stick figures holding hands, 1 tall male figure, 1 female figure with brown skin and curly hair, 2 small figures in the middle. Above them, floating like an angel, was another figure with yellow hair and wings. That's us, Mason explained, pointing. That's Daddy and you and me and Miles. And that's Mommy watching from heaven. Grace's eyes filled with tears. It's beautiful. The teacher said we should draw our family, Miles said, so we drew everyone. Everyone. Grace was in the picture. She was family. Can we hang it on the fridge? Mason asked. We can hang it everywhere, Grace said, pulling them into a hug. Alexander appeared in the doorway, home early again. He'd been doing that a lot, choosing his children over his empire. Realizing that all the money in the world meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. What's this? He asked. The twins showed him the drawing. Alexander stared at it for a long moment, at his dead wife watching over them, at his sons in the middle, at Grace, drawn into their family like she'd always been there. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "Absolutely perfect." That night they hung it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a heart. And every morning when Grace came down to make breakfast, she'd see it. A reminder of what they'd built, a reminder of what love could do, a reminder that sometimes families aren't born. Sometimes they're made, one broken person at a time, one choice to stay at a time, one moment of love triumphing over fear at a time. 1 year later, Grace stood in Catherine's garden and barely recognized it. The roses were blooming. The lavender filled the air with perfume. The memorial stone they'd placed for Catherine was surrounded by flowers the twins planted every week. "Presents for Mommy," they called them. Grace heard footsteps behind her and smiled. She knew those footsteps now. "They're sleeping," Alexander said, coming to stand beside her. The twins, now 5 years old, had finally started sleeping through the night. No more nightmares, no more tests, no more wondering if the adults would be there in the morning. "All the way through?" Grace asked. "All the way through," Alexander confirmed. "I checked on them twice just to make sure." Grace laughed. He'd become the most devoted father she'd ever seen. Overprotective, maybe, but after years of absence, his presence was a gift. "Grace," Alexander said, his tone shifting, "there's something I want to ask you." Grace turned to find him holding a small velvet box. Her heart stopped. "I know we said we'd take our time," Alexander said. "I know we agreed to let things develop naturally, and we have. A whole year of building this family. A whole year of proving to the twins and to ourselves that we're serious about this." He opened the box. A simple ring, elegant and understated, caught the moonlight. "I'm not asking you to be their mother. Catherine will always be their mother. And I'm not asking you to replace anyone. But I'm asking if you'll marry me. If you'll make this official in every possible way. If you'll be my wife and their Grace and part of this family forever." Grace looked at the ring, then at this man who'd been so broken when she met him, who'd learned to be whole again, who'd become not just a good father, but a good partner, who'd shown up every day for a year, proving that his promise to stay was real. "The twins know," Alexander added. "I asked them first. They said," he smiled, "they said I was being too slow. That they've been waiting forever for me to ask you." Grace laughed through her tears. "What did they say when you told them you were going to?" "Miles said it was about time. Mason asked if this meant you'd never leave. I told them yes. This means Grace is ours forever." They started planning the wedding immediately. Apparently there need to be flowers. Lots of flowers, and cake. Mostly cake. Grace couldn't stop smiling. "You asked them first." "Of course I did. This isn't just my family anymore. It's our family. We make big decisions together. Our family." Grace thought about the scared, broken woman who'd walked into this house a year ago, who'd been running from her past and convinced she had nothing to offer, who'd found 2 children who needed her, and a man who'd lost himself, and somehow, impossibly, became home. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. Yes to forever. Yes to being yours. Yes to this beautiful, messy, imperfect family we've built." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss that was gentle and sure and full of promise. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not running, for staying, for saving us." "You saved me too," Grace said. "We saved each other." They stood in Catherine's garden, where death had once meant the end of everything, and celebrated new life, new love, new family. And somewhere, Grace liked to think, Catherine was smiling, watching her boys laugh and play and heal, watching her husband learn to live again, watching a woman named Grace love the family she'd left behind. The next morning, the twins woke to find Grace making pancakes with a ring on her finger. They screamed, actually screamed with joy. "Does this mean what we think it means?" Miles shouted. "Are you getting married?" Mason added. "Are you going to be our real forever family?" Grace knelt down to their level. "I'm going to marry your father, and I'm going to be your Grace forever and ever. Nothing's changing except now it's official in every possible way." The twins launched themselves at her, nearly knocking her over, talking over each other in their excitement. Alexander watched from the doorway, his heart so full he thought it might burst. This was everything he'd thought he'd lost when Catherine died. Joy, laughter, family, home. And Grace had given it back to him, given it back to all of them. 6 months later, they got married in Catherine's garden. It was small, intimate, just close friends and the household staff who'd watched this family heal. The twins were ring bearers, dressed in tiny suits, taking their job incredibly seriously. Grace wore a simple dress, elegant and understated, with flowers from the garden in her hair. When Alexander saw her walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears. She was everything he'd never thought he'd have again. Love, partnership, hope. The ceremony was short. They'd written their own vows. Alexander promised to keep showing up, to keep choosing family, to keep being present even when it was hard. Grace promised to stay, to love his children as her own, to build a life together one day at a time. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Miles raised his hand. Everyone froze. Then Miles said, "I object to this taking so long. Can they kiss now?" Laughter rippled through the small gathering. The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Alexander kissed Grace like she was precious, like she was everything, like she was home. The twins cheered, the guests clapped, and in that garden where Catherine had once planted roses, a new family celebrated beginning. The reception was exactly what the twins had demanded. Lots of flowers, lots of cake, dancing under string lights. Grace found herself swaying with Alexander, their first dance as husband and wife, while the twins danced wildly nearby. "Happy?" Alexander asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace admitted. "I came here a year and a half ago thinking I was just taking a job, thinking I'd probably fail like everyone else. I had no idea." Her voice caught. "I had no idea I was coming home." Alexander pulled her closer. "You saved us, you know that, right? We were drowning and you jumped in." "You saved me too," Grace said. "I was running from my past, convinced I had nothing to offer. You and the boys taught me that broken doesn't mean worthless. That failure isn't permanent. That love is always worth the risk." They danced until the twins crashed from sugar and excitement, until the stars came out, until it was just the four of them. In a garden full of growing things, in a family built from broken pieces. As they walked back to the house, Mason reached for Grace's hand. "Grace? Yes, sweetheart? Thank you for staying." Grace squeezed his small hand. "Thank you for letting me." And there, in the doorway of a house that had once been a museum, that had once been cold and silent and full of grief, stood a family. Imperfect, unconventional, built from trauma and loss and the radical decision to love anyway. Two boys who'd learned that love doesn't always end in abandonment. A father who'd learned that grief doesn't have to mean the end of joy. A woman who'd learned that failure isn't final and second chances are real. They'd come together broken. They'd stay together healing. And that, Grace thought as she looked at her family, her husband, her boys, her home, that was what forever looked like. Not perfect, not easy, but absolutely, undeniably worth it. The screen fades to black. Final text appears. Some people come into our lives as strangers. Some leave as family. The bravest love is the one that stays when leaving would be easier. This is for every child who thought they were unlovable, for every parent who thought they'd failed, for every person who learned that family isn't just who you're born to, it's who you choose, who chooses you, and who stays when staying is the hardest thing in the world. Number closing call to action. So that's the story of how Grace Steve became more than a nanny. How two 4-year-old boys who'd driven away 17 caregivers finally found someone who wouldn't leave. How a billionaire tech entrepreneur learned to be a father again. How a woman running from her past found her future. But I want to know, what did you think? Have you ever dealt with a child who seemed unreachable? Have you ever been that child, testing people to see if they'd stay? Have you ever loved someone enough to fall down the stairs for them, literally or figuratively? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share your story. Tell us where you're watching from. This community is built on real experiences, real struggles, and real hope. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that broken people can heal and families can be built from the most unlikely pieces, hit that subscribe button, because we share stories like this every week. Stories about love that doesn't give up, about families that don't look traditional but are absolutely real, about second chances and redemption and the extraordinary courage it takes to stay. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. That friend who's fostering or adopting. That parent struggling with a difficult child. That person convinced they're too broken to be loved. Let them know there's always hope. There's always a chance to choose differently. There's always the possibility of forever family. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for believing that these stories matter. And remember, whether you're the one doing the staying or the one afraid people will leave, you're worthy of love that doesn't run away. Now go hug your people. Choose your family today, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, keep believing in second chances. Keep believing in love that stays. Keep believing that broken can become beautiful. Peace.